Welcome back to Music 101. We're talking about Chapter 11 today, or music ensembles. So, you can have solo music where somebody performs alone, or you can have groups of people that come together and perform music. The first group that we have is choral groups, or sung music. Sometimes they have a homogeneous sound, so they're a large body of singers is a chorus, and a choir is a smaller group of singers. They are broken up into, we talked about the different parts of a choir and the different voices when we're talking about range of sound and different timbres. We have the soprano, which is the highest voice in the choir, the alto, the tenor, and the bass. A cappella just means unaccompanied singers, so there's not any accompaniment as for piano or guitar or something like that. A magical choir or chamber choir is smaller and it has specialized ensembles. So if you want to think of it like caroling, like a caroling choir. Chamber ensembles are smaller groups of players. So for example, chamber music has 2 to even 12 players, one player playing a part. So for an example of a chamber ensemble is a string quartet, which consists of 2 violins, viola, and cello. So this is an example of a choir. Here's an example of some standard chamber ensembles. We have a solo instrument, violin or clarinet, and a piano. That's a duo or a duet. You could have 2 violins, a clarinet, and a trumpet, just 2 different instruments. Trios, you have string trio, which is violin 1, viola, or violin 1, violin 2, or cello. Piano trio, which is a piano, a violin, and a cello. String quartets, violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello. Piano quartet, piano, violin, viola, and cello, etc., etc. You can see the rest of those. This is an example of a string quartet. So 2 violins, a cello, and a viola. A duo sonata is a soloist with a piano. These are usually done unmemorized because, especially in the string worlds, violinists have to memorize their music, but a sonata does not have to be memorized because it's considered a duet. Piano trio, quartet, and quintets are piano and string instruments, and a string quartet is just string instruments. Woodwind and brass quintets are just woodwind and brass instruments. The orchestra is a heterogeneous performing body. So we talked about a homogeneous performing body, which is choir, or these chamber ensembles, which is the same family playing together. Heterogeneous is diverse instruments. So we have the Balinese orchestra, which is Balinese and Japanese, gongs, xylophone-like instruments, and drums. Then what we're familiar with, which is the symphony orchestra, the Western ensemble, strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Over 100 musicians are playing, and the strings are the heart of the orchestra. The best, of course, right? So this is kind of a basic setup of the orchestra. We have about 16 to 18 first violins, 16 to 18 second violins. First and second violin are just 2 different parts. First violin plays one part and second violin plays another, but they're all the same instrument. 12 violas, 10 to 12 cellos, 8 to 10 double basses, and 1 or 2 harps if needed. Then we have 2 to 3 flutes, 1 piccolo, 2 to 3 oboes, 1 English horn, 3 clarinets, a bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, a contrabassoon, 4 to 6 French horns, 4 trumpets, 3 trombones, 1 tuba, and about 3 to 5 players, including 1 timpani player. Some other music ensembles that you might be familiar with are the wind and jazz and rock bands. So a band is an American institution. It usually has winds and percussion at its core. So concert band is a wind ensemble, 40 to 80 players. It's kind of like the orchestra for band. It consists of flutes, the woodwinds, and the brass and percussion, and they're usually sitting down and they play music written for concert band. Marching band is what they use for sporting events, parades. It has military origins, and it's got drum majors and majorettes and flags and all of the things. So when you watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade and you see all of the marching bands, it consists of the brass and the woodwinds and the percussion, but they march instead of sitting in seats, which is what the concert band does. Jazz bands The instrumentation varies. We have the reed section, which has saxophones, or maybe the clarinet. We have the brass section, which is trumpets and trombones, and the rhythm section, which is the percussion, piano, double bass, and an electric guitar, and sometimes an acoustic guitar. Rock bands have amplified guitars, percussion, and synthesizers. So, of course, an example of a marching band, which you've all seen. If you've ever seen or been to a parade, like a Mardi Gras parade coming up. This is an example of a conductor. He's the conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And some of you might remember all of the string-colored instruments that were at the Super Bowl a couple years ago. And he directed that. It's a program that he directs in Los Angeles. So what is the role of the conductor? It's the leader of the larger ensembles. It helps with the interpretation of the music, deciding tempos, keeping the performers together. And we did some of the conducting patterns in class, but the conducting patterns show emphasis of the strong beats. They also rehearse the ensembles in practice sessions and use a baton, which I can kind of show you an example of. I can bring my baton to the next class, which is a stick to use to beat a standard metric pattern. The concertmaster is the first chair violinist, and they decide on uniform bowing. They also lead the orchestra. To be honest, a lot of professional orchestras watch the concertmaster more than they do the conductor. So it's a really, really, really important role in the orchestra. One of your assignments is the instrument identification, listening to Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. And what is really, really, really cool about this piece, and I would encourage you to listen to it, is it illustrates the instrument's timbres. There's a variation and a fugue on the theme of Purcell. A lot of you have seen Pride and Prejudice. It's actually the dance that Mr. Darcy and Lizzie dance to. And then it closes with this grand fugue, which a fugue is kind of like a round. There's an example of some basic conducting patterns, which we did some in class. A 2 is like a J, 3 is kind of like a triangle, 4 is kind of like a wall, door, or wall, floor, door, wall, ceiling. And then 6-8 is a little bit more complex, but that just kind of gives you a basic of some conducting patterns. So with Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, you have the theme, which has a broad, slow meter. Then it kind of breaks it up into all of the different instrument families. And then it ends with a big, giant fugue, which is a fragmented type of music, kind of like a round. So this is kind of a basic overview of what the orchestra looks like. We have the violins, first violins and second violins, the violas right here in the center, the cellos and the basses, then we have the woodwinds in the center, the brass in the back, and the percussion. So another picture of a symphony orchestra. This kind of gives you a breakdown of Benjamin's Young Person's Guide to an Orchestra. Definitely encourage you to listen to it. This kind of gives you a cheat here of what instrument families, like for example, the entire orchestra, then the woodwinds go first, and the brass and the strings, percussion, so that'll kind of aid you with your listening. And this just further breaks down what instruments are soloing. So this might be a good thing. This is in your book. A good thing to reference when you are listening and also filling out the instrument identification form. That's all for Chapter 11, and I will see you February 4th for our exam.